Elizabeth Thompson made her debut to Bloomington Normal audiences as the mezzo-soprano soloist in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with the Illinois Symphony Orchestra in 2018. An art song enthusiast, Thompson performs recital and chamber works on a regular basis, with a particular affinity for Russian, Scandinavian, and modern repertoire. Operatic highlights include leading roles in Carmen, Suor Angelica, Florencia and El Amazonas, Maria Stuarda, Die Zauberflöte, and The Consul. Thompson earned a Doctorate of Musical Arts degree from the University of Illinois in 2015 and has received awards through the Orpheus National Vocal Competition and the Metropolitan Opera National Council auditions. A student-centric teacher, she emphasizes skills which provide a technical foundation to support thoughtful dramatic communication and longevity of the vocal instrument. Thompson teaches applied voice and vocal pedagogy at Illinois State University and serves as the voice area coordinator.
Hello everyone, I'm Elizabeth Thompson. I'll be presenting an introductory approach to the vocal acoustic software Voce Vista Video, with particular attention to how this can be a useful tool during the pandemic when so many of us are teaching remotely. I know that I have discovered some unique challenges as I've been teaching, largely over my computer over the last few months, one of which is the limited visualization of students' bodies. Since their body is their instrument, sometimes there's a limited amount of visual information that we're able to gauge, particularly if the setup only allows us to view the upper part of the student's body. There's also the impact of software filtration on the perception of tone. Even something like Zoom, which recently had an upgrade to allow for more music-friendly settings, all of which is great and I'm grateful to have. It's important to keep in mind, particularly with things related to tone, that we're not receiving an entirely natural amount of aural information with a filtered sound coming through the computer. And then this can be affected too by the quality of the hard technology as well. Things like external microphones and speakers, computer cameras, or the internet connection, all of which we can attempt to improve as best we can. But if a student has limited budget and isn't able to get quality hardware, if they're studying at home or in a house full of roommates and everybody has to use the internet at the same time for work or class or lessons, all of those things may affect the viability of the work that we do remotely without additional adaptations. And then there are possible changes in the student's perception of what we offer as well, either in terms of visual information or oral information, particularly with regard to teaching that typically relies on demonstration or imitation or even hands-on body work. One thing that I'm looking forward to once we're on the other side of this pandemic and we're able to return to safely teaching in person in the mode in which we're used to, is that I'm hoping that I myself will have additional skills and resources and approaches as a teacher that I might not have had previously. So my hope with this presentation is not to take away what is already available, but to supplement that with a tool that may help fill in some of the gaps in the meantime. So what is the software we're actually looking at today? I'm using Voce Vista Video. It's not the only vocal acoustic software that exists, but it's the one that I'm familiar with. So that's what we will be using today. And the software provides spectral analysis in either real time or through imported audio. So this is something that you can use live with a student in a lesson. It's also something that if a student has an internet connectivity issue, or if you want to be able to check some of this information with better quality audio that a student can record on their end and then send to you, you're able to take that audio file, put it into the software, and then have the same kind of analysis that you might live. I also want to point out that this is only one of many pedagogical means and tools at our disposal. This may be helpful for some teachers, not others. This may be helpful for some students and not others. But like so many of the approaches and methods that we do work with, it's our jobs as teachers to find something that's going to work for our students and work for them with the circumstances we have. So an example I like to use is something like a mirror, which I have behind me. A mirror provides visual feedback for the body. Voce Vista provides visual feedback for our sound. So there are uses both from a teaching side as well as from a student's perspective. For the teacher, there's acoustic analysis to assist in matters specifically of registration, and then resonance strategies and timbre. Some of the things that I'm going to point out in the course of this presentation are the visual clues that we can get from this software, which can point towards things like pharyngeal space, tongue position, laryngeal position. Once you learn some basic sort of visual clues, some basic acoustic information, there is a lot that we can deduce from what we see visually that then allows us to incorporate that in a more traditional way for the student. It's a very demonstrative teaching tool. And there's the visual confirmation or perhaps clarification for what our ears already hear. As I mentioned before, the oral information can be limited or distorted during remote voice lessons, depending on other technology and other factors. And this kind of acoustic analysis can provide additional diagnostic information for us that can either confirm our instincts from what we're already seeing and hearing, or perhaps can help us understand that the information that we're receiving in this manner may not be exactly what we would expect. For the student, I find that this is especially effective for visual learners, regardless of whether they're beginning or advanced. It's effective for more cerebral students. I teach vocal pedagogy at my university as well as teach a studio of applied lessons. And I find this to be helpful as a teaching tool within the class, and sometimes those students that are either in pedagogy and so therefore want to have some hands-on experimentation with some of what we're talking about conceptually, or students that I work with in the studio that just happen to be a little more cerebral in how they process information. I found this to be helpful as well. There are visual clues for use of vibrato, for choice of vowel, things like, is the student actually singing the vowel that they think they're singing? Once you learn some of the vowel visualization patterns within the software, students can sort of hunt for those shapes and patterns while learning how they actually have to produce from a physical standpoint or from an auditory standpoint, understanding what they have to do to produce a certain shape, sound, timbre, vowel. There are visual cues for the legato line and for registration events, much like I mentioned on the teaching side. Another element that I'm going to demonstrate within the software is something called a frequency filter. And this offers a really tangible representation of just how complex our voices are. And the students that I work with are college age. And so it's not an undeveloped voice, but it's perhaps an untrained voice. And this can be a really good way for them to come to terms with what is often a very intangible concept, this idea of many harmonics and colors existing in one voice. And traditionally, as teachers, will talk about things like chiaroscuro. This can provide a visual example of what those things actually are. And sometimes that can be helpful for the student to understand why we have to do some of the things that we do. So some of the basic visual components in Voce Vista are the spectrogram and the spectrum. We'll show these in more detail in a moment, but the spectrogram you can see a portion of just in this picture I have on the left-hand side. So the spectrogram shows harmonic activity over time. The spectrum, which there's just a little snippet of it over here on the right, over which I'm putting my cursor, the spectrum shows harmonic activity in a specific moment in time. There's also a timeline to show the entirety of the recording or the entirety of what has been input into the software. There's color coding. You can see some of that here in this example. We'll look at that more momentarily. These frequency filters, which we will explore. And then there's also a vowel chart, which can be very helpful, but I'm not demonstrating today. But if you have interest, there is more available within the software, which can be a helpful teaching tool. So before we continue into specific case studies, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page with basic acoustic vocabulary. I'd also like to point out that I'm gearing this presentation towards application, using the software as a teaching tool rather than as an analytical tool. And so I'm going to oversimplify some of the scientific information, not because that scientific information isn't important or wouldn't be worthwhile to discuss, but for sake of the presentation and the time limit that we have, I really want to get into what we do with this in the studio with a student and how we can utilize it that way. So some of the vocabulary you'll hear me use is talking about harmonics and formants, which are related but not the same thing. Harmonics are determined by pitch. And the lowest harmonic, the first harmonic, we also call the fundamental frequency. That lowest harmonic is the one that we perceive as the pitch of a tone. And regardless of where that fundamental frequency is, regardless of what pitch we perceive, the pattern of the harmonics, you would think of those as being overtones. The pattern of those harmonics from bottom moving upward is the same pattern regardless of the pitch. And that pattern is from the first harmonic to the second, a perfect eighth, from the second to the third, a fifth, third to fourth is a perfect fourth, etc. And so those relationships are maintained regardless of where our pitch lies. Formants, on the other hand, are determined by vowel. I'm going to oversimplify this, and I'm going to ignore the fact that they're still developing research into how we best want to articulate this. But thinking in terms of application, if harmonics are determined by pitch, formants are determined by vowel. Formants are pre-existing locations where there's the potential for heightened harmonic activity. So if a harmonic lines up with the location where we might expect a formant to be, we'll often see that there's a strengthening of that harmonic. It's actually just that the harmonic's not getting dampened, but we will perceive that, we'll see that visually as being strengthened or being activated or excited. These locations, again, in these predetermined places, according to vowel, for the first formant, are in these locations I have here. So the E vowel and the U vowel both have a first formant in the area of 330 hertz, which is about E4. The A and the O vowel both have a first formant location at approximately 523 hertz, which is around C5. And then the ah vowel has this predetermined location of approximately 784 hertz, which is the G5. The first formant we associate with the pharynx. The second formant we associate with the oral cavity. So depending on what these relationships are between the harmonics and the formants, that can visually cue us in to other things that are occurring physically. Is the larynx in a low position? Is the larynx high? Are the pharyngeal constrictors too activated? Is the tongue getting pulled forward or back, etc.? This is visual information that we can diagnose to then filter into activities for our students. Then there's also the famous singers formant cluster. This is a group of formant activity, which when present, it's not always present, but when it is, we usually find it between 2200 and 4000 hertz, if I'm being generous. And that's often that's the third, fourth, and fifth formants clustering together. This is an epilaryngeal resonance, meaning that we believe that this formant activity occurs in the epilarynx. So getting visually oriented with the software itself, this is a screenshot of an excerpt that I had pulled up in Voce Vista. And so this is what the screen will look like. This is just in a still version, so we can discuss what we're looking at. In the bottommost layer, so this horizontal bottom area is our timeline, running from left to right from the beginning of the recording to the end. And then this portion at the end, which is highlighted in orange, which also has this very faint little box around it, that's the portion that I am looking at in my spectrogram. So this orange bit in my timeline, we see in detail that phrase in time, the harmonic activity in our spectrogram. Our spectrogram is organized with frequency on the vertical axis from bottom to top, 500 hertz, 1000, 1500, etc. And you'll notice that these frequencies are evenly spaced. This is evenly spaced because I have it in a linear view, which is my preference because I find it just easier to view the harmonics in that way. One could switch it to a logarithmic view, which would adjust the relationships for the frequency, but instead have this keyboard on the left-hand side. Those keys would be spaced evenly. So that's if you're thinking in pitch. This linear view, though, I prefer because that evenly spaces our frequencies instead. And then we have time running left to right on our horizontal axis of the spectrogram. And you'll see this blue fuzz. That's just white noise in the background, nothing to worry about, probably a fan or the light buzzing, something like that. On this right-hand side is the spectrum, which has intensity measured in decibels on the horizontal axis, and then frequency is, I apologize, on the vertical axis, intensity on the vertical axis, frequency on the horizontal axis running left to right. So where it's my spectrogram, I have my first harmonic on the bottom, second above that, third above that, etc. In my spectrum, I have my first harmonic strong here on the left, and then to the right is the second harmonic, to the right of that is the third, the fourth, etc. Some other things to become familiar with visually. I'm now switching to Voce Vista itself, and I'm going to demonstrate a couple of things which one can utilize with students, but also to get you oriented with the program. So I'm first going to vocal fry my cardinal vowels, and you'll see some of these formant shapes that I'm talking about, where this activity occurs according to my vocal tract shape, which I determine by vowel. And if I brighten this a bit, you can see more of those details. I'm not going to demonstrate this in length today with any case studies, but becoming familiar with some of these shapes, either with these color patterns in the spectrogram or the kind of the wave-like shape of the harmonic activity that we see in the spectrum over here, I have found this to be helpful with some of my students, that if they're not producing a vowel clearly, or perhaps don't realize whether they are or are not modifying a certain way. I'm also not originally from the Midwest, and so there's certain dialectical differences that sometimes surprise me. I have found with certain students that it can be really helpful for them to just search for these patterns as they're singing, regardless of whether they understand acoustically the information before them. Another thing that can be helpful is pointing out things like straight tone versus vibrato. ah. And I'm actually going to just adjust my settings a little bit. Ah, ah. We can see here visually that where I'm straight toning it, it literally looks more flatlined. It literally looks more straight, especially as you're looking at those lower harmonics. Whereas when I allow the vibrato to come in, we again get a slightly different shape and kind of coloring on the right-hand side, but especially in the spectrum on the left, you see that vibrato as squiggles. You can see whether it's straight tone or vibrato. You can also tell that when I started my vibrato, I started with a little straight tone, and so we ease into those swiggle lines. Those are all things that can be pointed out to the student as well. And then they kind of play target practice as they go. They're singing, trying to create certain patterns or shapes. The other thing that I'm going to demonstrate now is the use of these frequency filters. And I also have uploaded now a professional recording as opposed to just examples that I've taken for myself or from my students in the studio. This is a recording of Pavarotti singing the end of A Mes Amis, and it's visually a little bit cluttered, partially because we also have the orchestra in there, and partially because the settings are slightly different in the recording than they are with my computer audio. But I'm going to demonstrate the filter now. And we have that wonderful high C, which Pavarotti is so famous for. And if I highlight just the high C to separate that, and then I earlier had gone into my settings under filters and add new frequency filter, and that is where I got this little box from, which I'm now just skinnying up a bit. I can actually separate the individual harmonics and we can hear them uniquely. This first harmonic sounds like this. It's very hooty sounding. I'm going to pull that in a little bit. This is our second harmonic, which is an octave above that. The third harmonic, which Pavarotti is so famous for spiking and getting a lot of activity in that third harmonic. That's one of the reasons that he had the quality of sound that he did. And then we get into the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh. You can hear those relationships between the harmonics shifting. We got a second in there. And then if I slowly drag this down, we'll hear the singers form it group. The singers form it cluster, rather. That has that ringing quality, and that's what allows especially low voices to cut over the orchestra. And I'm going to slowly incorporate the other harmonics. It takes us a few moments for our ears and our brains to reintegrate all of those harmonics and hear them as one cohesive tone. By being able to break those up, again, this is sometimes a really helpful learning tool for students to understand just how complex those voices are and to understand some of the method behind the madness of what we do. Coming back to the presentation, I now have some case studies. So I have 3 students who volunteered either working with me or providing some recordings for us to view. The first of which is my student Thomas. He actually graduated a couple of years ago, so I don't work with him anymore, but occasionally he'll touch base, and he was willing to provide some samples for today's presentation. Thomas is a very high energy singer, And so one of the first things that we'll see an example of has to do with efficiency. This is related to a lot of different things like resonance strategy, registration, for him also a little bit of muscular tension, which we will observe. But a piece of vocabulary I've used with him in the past is this idea of taking the foot off the gas, just pulling back a little bit so that we find what is efficient rather than what is most effortful. And then the second example we'll look at with Thomas has to do with this legato line and the visual relationships between what we see as vowels to what we see as being gaps created by consonants. And then we play with that a little bit. So this first example, this is great. One other thing I want to play with you has to do with where we see this activity in terms of like the bottom versus the top of a pitch, okay? And that's something we see on the spectrogram side as opposed to the spectrum side. The spectrum we see, for me, sort of those vowel shapes, those spikes where we have activity between the second and the third harmonics. On the left-hand side, we can kind of see just across the continuum of time where we're living in those notes. If I just give you the visual component and say, bring that bright color to the center as opposed to the upper end, let's see what happens with that. Okay, come back down here. Let's go with O, shifting to as you get higher. Good. Do that one again. Wiggle your shoulders while you do it. Good. Keep wiggling the shoulders. 10% less. Yes. Good. Good. Keep wiggling those shoulders. Keep it 10% under. You sing just that line again and see if you can minimize the consonant gaps. Think as much color and vowel as possible.
Dein ist mein ganzes Herz, wo du nicht bist, kann ich nicht sein.
Beautiful, already better. Now, use the voiced consonants to your advantage. Think about pitching all of those voiced consonants, and then we'll see that in color as well.
Okay. Dein ist mein ganzes Herz, wo du nicht bist, kann ich nicht sein.
Good. I want to show you a very slight detail. And again, we're talking about options and we're talking about awareness, not necessarily good or bad. And especially with a piece like this, there's a lot of stylistic schmaltz, which we would want and expect. But on this very last note, sein, look at where our consonant is as opposed to where our vowel is. Any guesses as to what that means?
That the Z was pitched lower than the actual ah.
Exactly. Can you do this line one more time and see if you can pitch that Z with your vowel?
Dein ist mein ganzes Herz, wo du nicht bist, kann ich nicht sein.
Oh, so fantastic. And you may or may not have done this on purpose, but by my bringing your attention to the one spot on the Z, you also applied that concept to all of your other consonants, and everything was pitched right at the vowel. Yes. All right, coming back to the presentation, you'll notice that in both examples, Thomas was able to adjust pretty quickly Again, he's had some experience with this in my vocabulary before, but it's a good example of the kinds of things one can do with a student. I also just want to point out that the timing in the recorded Zoom session is not entirely representing the timing that we had on his end at the time. The spectrogram is running ever so slightly behind where he is. He was actually able to see those things as he was doing them. So I just want to clarify that in case that brings any confusion into the presentation.
Would you say?
So going into our next student example, again, I want to just clarify some vocabulary that I'll be utilizing. And these have to do with registration events for the treble voice. An F1-H1 coupling, which means that our first formant and our first harmonic are working together. This is the primary treble strategy. We traditionally might think of this as being head voice, although head voice is not quite as inclusive of vocabulary as we might want it to be if we're thinking in terms of both the phonation component and the resonance component to registration. But we tend to affiliate that with the timbre of F1-H1. This also allows trebles to turn over above the treble clef, but when it's in the middle, it's perceived as a more lofty or round tone. This also occurs with falsetto in non-treble voices. The F1-H2 coupling, which means that the first formant is working together with the second harmonic, this is the primary non-treble strategy below the secondo passaggio, so before a non-treble voice turns over. We also associate this traditionally with chest voice and treble voices, but it can also just be a more visceral, exciting, sometimes bright, that stentorian tone in the middle voice for a treble. So depending on the voice type, depending on the weight of the voice, depending on the color or the timbre of the vocal tone, we can sometimes see either F1-H1 or F1-H2 in the middle voice of a treble. But what's really important is that regardless of that, this F1-H1 coupling, in order to turn over, is really necessary. That's high enough that the F1-H2 coupling is no longer going to be efficient for us. And so that's one of the things that we're going to observe with these next two examples. There's also the F1-H2 uncoupling, which other teachers will describe differently. I like this vocabulary. This is for non-treble seeking to turn over at their secondo passaggio. This is something else that I've utilized Voce Vista for, working with tenors and basses, but I'm not demonstrating that today. So our first treble example is my student Ivana. She's a soprano, but she started out training as a mezzo. She's a treble voice, of course, as a soprano, and we're dealing with registration nearing the top of the treble staff, nearing the secondo passaggio. We work on this in a couple of different ways. I first want to say that the pitches we're dealing with in this example are an E flat and an E at the top of the staff, which is a little lower than a soprano would need to really turn over. But looking at Ivana's habits when we went through this Voce Vista analysis is that Ivana actually will naturally turn over on a D and will be turned over on an F. So that means that there's something else kind of funky going on with the E flat and the E, mainly because of context. And for her, depending on what she does that with that E flat and E can determine whether she really easily gets above that. And so this has to do with her stamina as well as her ease in her top. We attempted a couple of different things. First, adjusting via vowel. Didn't get much of a difference just working that way. We also checked in with her articulators. Ivana has TMJ and so has still has some tension we're dealing with in the jaw, so we checked that. We had more success though adjusting her tongue position, specifically thinking about releasing down in the back of the tongue, which to me suggested that there was an impact on the laryngeal position. So we were seeing an issue with the registration event because the larynx was a little high, but the larynx was a little high because of tension in the tongue. So we're constantly dealing with the chicken, egg, chicken scenario when we look through all of these diagnostic clues. And so when we were able to lower the larynx, that's when we saw the most difference. Rather than an audio example, though, I just have visual examples for Ivana, some before and after. So this first screen is showing 2 befores, one in an exercise and one in repertoire. And you'll see that in both cases, we're getting an F1H2 coupling. So our second harmonic is boosted higher than our first harmonic. That is, again, the strategy we might see lower in the voice or for certain colors in the middle. For Ivana, she has a very naturally classical oriented sound. So it doesn't sound like she's, belting. It doesn't sound like she's straining. But again, context for her and then going above that, this has an effect. And so having that strong H2 is a sign to us that she's not yet turned over on that note. So this is before we did any release work on the tongue or the larynx. After, we see a difference. So this is after we did some laryngeal massage and then did some exercises to release the tongue, did some warm-ups or vocalises that had to do with different vowel shapes, sensing that release of the tongue regardless of vowel, etc. And this first one, again, is in an exercise. The second one is in the repertoire. And you'll see that in the exercise, after getting that release, we get a beautiful drop off between H1 and H2, telling us that she's fully turned over. We did not get quite that much of a release in the repertoire, but we often see that as teachers, especially with very emotive singers, there's sometimes a difficulty in transferring what we do technically in an exercise to the repertoire. So we don't get quite that release there, but it's still much more release than we had prior to the laryngeal massage and the tongue work, meaning that we're on the right track, but we need to find a way to get that more consistently in the repertoire. It takes time. We're adjusting musculature, so that's not unexpected, but we still see an improvement. My last example is my student Jessica, who's also a soprano, but a very different kind of soprano than Ivana. Jessica's young with a very sizable voice. The excerpts that I'm going to show you are actually in Voce Vista rather than in a PowerPoint. And these were warm-ups that I asked the student to put together on her own. So they're self-guided warm-ups, but she's using Voce Vista for all the visual cues to confirm whether she's actually getting the thing that we work on together in lessons. The student had a history of high laryngeal pressure, which is not unusual for a young, large voice. But for her, because her stamina was so strong, she could get away with a lot of high laryngeal pressure, unnecessary pressure. She would be able to get away with a lot of that before it would really cause her noticeable problems. And then by that point, it was quite tight. And so that high laryngeal position caused by that tightening of overpressurization for a long time was affecting clean phonation. We worked on this for probably a year and a half before we really got those muscles to release and get her to sense that low sort of buoyant laryngeal position that would work more efficiently for her. She's very cerebral, and she's benefited from both traditional pedagogy and working in the software. But I had her use the software to show how she can, on her own, follow these cues, watching for that F1-H1 coupling and the decoupling of H2 as we move across the upper passaggio. So the first set of warm-ups I had her do is sustained on an ah. So you can see that when she's lower in her voice, this is a C. When she's on a C, that's low enough that she doesn't have to turn over. And we can see that naturally her voice has a lot of strength in that second harmonic. That's one of the things that allows her timbre to be so visceral and exciting in the middle. And then she has a lot of singer's form and activity. And as she gets higher, we're still not turned over there, which is okay. Same thing there, but we get a little bit of a more steady sound. And then this is where she starts to turn over. I think this is an E. Yes, on the E. We start seeing that drop off of H2. And we start seeing more drop off of H2. And then again, we see that greater decrease once she gets to F. The second exercise that I'll show you that she did, go back to the beginning, is a moving exercise. Big voices tend to love to sustain, but I also have her working in movement, and we see that she is able to make the same adjustments. So similarly, we get more of that H2 earlier on, and then by the end, we start getting a little bit more of that H2 drop off. So some final thoughts. I tried to anticipate some Q&A since we're not able to do that actively together today. One that I've heard before is, how much do you explain this to students, particularly with regard to the scientific information? For me, it depends a little on the student. Some students, like Jessica, who's very cerebral, she's also taking my pedagogy class this semester. For her, it has been really helpful to have information about what is actually acoustically happening and why. For other students, I might not actually explain that, as long as it's still helpful for them to have the visual guide. Things like, am I vibrating or not? Am I creating this vowel shape? Am I getting certain peaks in places? I can describe the visual component without necessarily explaining all the science behind it, not because an understanding of the science wouldn't be helpful, but for some students, they don't want to be sorting through all of that in the moment when they're in the studio, when they're singing, but they get visual reminders of what is successful and what's not. I let their responsiveness and kind of their instinctual way of learning help guide me in that. I also will just say as a reminder that I don't use this with all of my students. We have a lot of tools at our disposal as teachers, and I try to adjust the kinds of tools I utilize and the kind of vocabulary I use depending on my student and their learning needs. But for whom this is helpful, that's my approach. Another question that I've heard before is, do singers actively think about these acoustic strategies while they're singing? I'd like to point to that example of the Pavarotti recording. I mentioned he's famous for spiking that third harmonic, but I don't think Pavarotti was actually thinking, as he's on stage performing, I'm boosting my third harmonic. But he learned or instinctually knew how to get that efficient sound, how to find that timbre that worked so well for him. And so I think that it depends a little bit about where we are in the learning process. Are we in the diagnostic and technical discovery portion? Or are we later in the process when we hopefully have established those physical habits so that we then just have those colors and tools and approaches at our disposal depending on the emotional and dramatic content? So like any technical approach, this teaching tool helps establish those habits and help develop self-awareness. but then hopefully we get to the point where we let that go and focus on other things. So I will leave you with some further resources for whom this is interesting. If people want to learn more or explore other possibilities. There's other software as well, but I included a link for Voce Vista. And the company that makes Voce Vista Video makes a couple other versions as well, one that's more simplified than the one I showed today, one that has additional elements to what I utilized. Voce Vista was originally conceptualized by the late Donald Gray Miller, but they still have that software in development by this company. There's also the Mata voice synthesizer, which I know that Ken Bozeman likes using. It's a really nice demonstrative tool for if we adjust some of the frequencies and vowels, then it produces kind of a mimicked voice and tone to represent what we can orally expect with those adjustments. That's really handy. There's also one called Sing and See, which I've not yet utilized myself, but I know it's available, and I know that I've seen it in other NATS bulletins. There's also a lot of reading available. These are only 2 of many, but Donald Gray Miller's book, Resonance and Singing, and then Ken Bozeman's Practical Vocal Acoustics. I find those to be really foundational, both in understanding the science and in having practical tools for application. There are also various conferences and seminars on vocal acoustics. This seems to be a growing subfield in vocal pedagogy, so I don't think that there will be a lessening of that research and interest. So I encourage you to seek out some of those presentations, conferences, etc. And then if this interests you either for your own understanding of this material or in terms of how you might utilize this information or the software in your teaching, I recommend experimenting with your own voice. Get a test version of the software if you're unsure, and play around with it. It can be really informative just to understand, not necessarily to make our voice do anything, not necessarily to change something, but it gives us more information, and more information I find to only be a good thing. So I hope this has been helpful for some of you. Thank you for taking the time to listen and watch today, and I wish all of you the best as you continue teaching. Thank you.